I'll continue and let's just give it a sec to register there. Okay, beautiful. All right, so thanks everyone. I will now hand over and just introducing all of our beautiful and esteemed panelists here today. Can I please get, when I say your name, just do a quick wave. I know everybody can see you. So that will be amazing. So for the first person on our list today is Shakina Rajendram. And I'm just going to read off a little bit of the bio, if that's okay. I know that was sent to everybody as well before, so I'm just going to quickly read a little bit about her. Dr. Shakina is an assistant professor in the teaching stream and the coordinator of the language teaching field in the Department of Curriculum Teaching Learning at OISE. She's also the course and curriculum development lead for supporting English language learners in the Master of Teaching program at OISE. Shakina's teaching and research focus on teacher education, TransLanguaging, and multiliteracy pedagogies, and supporting multilingual learners in K-12 and higher education contexts internationally. So thank you so much, Shakina, for joining us today and leading this discussion. We also have our other presenters, and I will introduce them now, and then they can take over as we go on in the presentation. But Jennifer Burton is joining us today as well. Hi there. Jennifer Burton is a PhD candidate in the Language and Literacies Education program at OISE. She has over 13 years of language teaching experience in Canada and abroad. Her research and teaching interests center on creative and critical pedagogies in higher education. Jennifer's dissertation examines student and teacher experiences with spoken word poetry in an English for academic purpose course. Thank you so much for joining. We're so happy to have you. And I'm looking here as well. I see Wales Wong. Hi, Wales. Thank you so much for joining us today. Wales Wong is a PhD candidate in the Language and Literacy Education program at OISE. She specializes in English and as a second language education at the secondary level and has taught adolescents and adults for the past 15 years. Her current research focuses on the development and implementation of TransLanguaging pedagogies to support plurilingual adult learners in continuing education programs. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're so happy to hear what you have to present today. Last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Jeff Bale. Hi, Dr. Jeff Bale. Dr. Jeff Bale is an associate professor of language and literacy education at OISE. His research applies political, economic, anti-racist, and critical perspectives on language policies in education and teacher education. Dr. Bale currently leads 3 research projects: More Than Just Good Teaching, mainstream teacher education for supporting English learners, critical perspective on teacher education and linguist diversity in migration societies and language, race, and the regulation of difference, the Heritage Languages program in Ontario. Thank you so much again for joining and giving us your time today, all of our esteemed panelists. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Shakina Rajendram.
Thank you so much, Sargam, for the really kind introduction, and thank you, Cyril, for the invitation to be here. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on a Friday afternoon. We're just so happy to see so many familiar faces and some new faces and names as well. The study we're presenting today is on preparing teachers, and actually we should add preparing future teachers to support multilingual learners in Ontario's classrooms using TransLanguaging and multiliteracy pedagogies. But this study is part of a broader project of which Dr. Jeff Bale, is the principal investigator. So I'm going to turn things over to Jeff to do our land acknowledgement and then to introduce the project before we go into the details of the specific study. So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks. So we do want to begin with a formal land acknowledgement used at the University of Toronto, to which we wish to acknowledge this land in which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As we've given these presentations, I guess over the last 6 or 8 months or 10 months, whatever it's been, we wanted to remind people that land acknowledgements as a symbolic statement now have their own role to play, but also to draw direct connections to the way these acknowledgements need to be or should be connected to action. So given the experience of unmarked graves being discovered right across Canada in terms of residential schools, we wanted to bring people's attention again to parts of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada from the final report from 2015 that speak to this issue, and the decades-long efforts among Indigenous people to bring attention to missing children and to unmarked graves at residential schools, and the reality of those graves being finally acknowledged and responded to in our current times. As Shakina mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the paper we're sharing today, which to really stress is really the work of Shakina, Jennifer, and Wales, comes from a larger project. You can see all the team members there at the bottom of the screen. It has this very long title that we originally had. The book we're writing on this has a bit of a different title, but it's a project that's been underway since, I guess, 2016. And the formal research ended just over a year ago. And so now we're working on much of the dissemination of our findings, including this paper today. So my role in the presentation today is to give some of that some of the overview rather of the project itself, and I'll touch on these four areas to set that up today. The impetus of the study was an important change to teacher education policy that took effect in 2015. It was announced in 2013, but took effect in 2015. Which the College of Teachers in Ontario calls enhanced teacher education. There were a number of important structural changes to teacher education. I won't go through the details, but for our purposes, the more important part of these changes had to do with the substance, the content of teacher education, and new requirements for what teacher education providers like OISE are now required to do with their pre-service teachers. One of those areas the College of Teachers identified is this area of supporting English language learners, which is to say that all teacher candidates in Ontario, irrespective of their future teaching grade, of their future teaching content area, all candidates must learn about supporting English language learners in their pre-service programs. Teacher candidates also need to learn about supporting French language learners if they're being certified in French language systems. OISE only prepares teachers for English language schools, so that's the focus of our research. At OISE, as the Master Teaching Program serves as the flagship teacher education program. It's the only program remaining now at this point. But as the program was overhauled to meet the requirements of this new policy, it became something like this. It is now a 20-month program, 5-term program that leads both to a master's degree and to a teaching credential. Depending on the grade level at which people are seeking certification, the program consists of 18 to 20 courses, as well as 4 month-long practicum placements. The pandemic has disrupted a lot of the practicum stuff, but that's the structure of the program. It's had to respond in real-time ways, of course, with lockdowns and school closures. Can you go back 1 second? Just to say that what the program did to constitute many of these 18 or 20 courses was to round out a number of courses dealing with equity and diversity, and to require all candidates to take them. You can see in this diagram that Antoinette created the titles of those courses as they exist in the program, and supporting English language learners is one of those several courses. So at this course It's changing quite rapidly, but it's typically considered a year 2 course, which is to say it happens in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th term of the course of the program. It's a half course, a 36-hour semestered course that the candidates take, and we offer it organized by the grade bands at which people become certified to teach in Ontario. As with almost all courses in the program, candidates are cohorted into groups of about 30 candidates per section. So that means we offer 15 or so sections of this course per year. So it's a major instructional part of the program. And as people who are familiar with teacher education will know, this course reflects many of the contradictions around consistency in teacher education, which is to say that when the course is offered in the program impacts the structure of the course, which changes what's possible for us to do as instructors in each particular section. And of course, the 15 sections, there's a large instructional team, which ourselves, we're diverse in terms of our own personal, educational, and professional backgrounds. And we bring that diversity to bear on making sense of what it means to support multilingual learners in the classroom. To work with this consistency, not to overcome it, but to work with it, the instructional team meets regularly. Shakina is now the course leader, in fact, who organizes these meetings. And as well, there are 3 common assignments in the course that all sections of the course use, irrespective of other readings and activities the instructors do. I mentioned it here because the 3rd of those, the unit plans, becomes an important part of the paper that, that my colleagues will share with you later on today. So in terms of the project now, let me share some information about how we designed and framed it. We originally set out 2 objectives for this SSHRC-funded study. The first was to focus on multilingual students, multilingual learners themselves, understanding them in turn and how they think of their own diversity, their own strengths and needs, and then to square their sense of themselves against the policy and how it projects or imagines multilingual learners to be in the province. A second objective is more ethnographic in nature and has to do with the many people involved in teacher education, namely candidates, teacher educators, practicing teachers in local schools, and how they all interpret and enact this particular policy requirement. To meet those objectives, to meet the first objective in particular, we designed a video-based profile that has come to be called MeMaps. This is work that Professor Antoinette Gagné has headed up. These MeMaps, they use a technology, an app called Flipgrid, that allows multilingual learners to respond to a number of prompts that the research team created. These prompts focus on multilingual learners in terms of their linguistic repertoire, their life milestones, their hopes and aspirations, and they're an opportunity for us to get a sense of how multilingual learners think about themselves and who they are and want to be in the world. Both our research team and the second research project, it's also SSHRC funded, that Antoinette heads up, together have created 36 edited video profiles that, like I say, they've come to be known as MeMaps. For our project, we've used them, like I said before, as a foil, as an interpretive tool for policy interpretation, but also as a pedagogical resource in this required course supporting English language learners, while Antoinette and Emmanuel and their project are using the MeMaps for other purposes that have to do more with MeMapping as a pedagogical question. To meet the second objective, we have a multi-stranded approach to the research that centers on an ethnographic case study of the Supporting English Language Learners course. We conducted observations in 10 sections of the course over 3 academic years. We collected coursework from just about 150 candidates, interviewed or conducted focus groups, over 50 candidates, interviewed members of the instructional team, and have field notes and other recollections from Shakina, from myself, and from Antoinette. I left her name off there, excuse me. We also had access to a German language test, a pedagogical content knowledge test for understanding what they call competencies for supporting multilingual learners. And we used that German version to create one of our own that we're calling a pedagogical content knowledge for language inclusive teaching test, or the Paclit Test. We have debated what to call this bloody thing for 2 years, and this is it. This is what we're calling it. This is the thing. It's called the Paclit Test. More importantly, we had over 400 teacher candidates who responded, and including the pilot study, about almost 600 total responses on this instrument. And then finally, moving beyond the program itself, the research team conducted interviews with 12 ESL teachers and subject specialists, most of whom work in Ontario. And then Julie Karakesh headed up this comparative analysis looking at the other teacher education programs in Ontario and how they understood and have responded to this policy requirement. That analysis is based on both publicly available documents as well as interviews with 10 of Ontario's 16 teacher education institutions. In terms of framing the study, there's a lot to say here, not a lot of time. So the one takeaway, the one main idea I would like people to hold on to is that while there is a burgeoning research agenda, a research area on teacher education, preparing candidates to work with multilingual learners, it's good that this research is growing. It continues to be characterized by really intense disciplinary isolation. That is to say, there's a series of work coming from applied linguists to do work on this question. And the primary focus from applied linguists has been to develop conceptual models and then to apply those in teacher education programs. Some of the most prominent are the linguistically responsive teaching model developed in the US. In Germany, it's the DATSCOM model, which stands for German as Second Language Competencies. I've forgotten why the US got all pieces there. Oh, sorry, that's using a complexity theory framework to develop a model for what teacher education might look like from an applied linguistic perspective to frame supporting multilingual learners. The important idea there, though, is that applied linguistics in general, and then as an extension, applied linguistics on this question has been hesitant at times and really has refused at times to take questions of racism and colonialism seriously in their analysis of multilingualism. And we see that in these conceptual models, less so in Viescas, but in the first I mentioned, we see those in those models. By contrast, the last thing I want to say there's actually not a lot of research yet from applied linguistic perspectives on this question. By contrast, there's a mountain of research, particularly from Germany, from Northern Europe more broadly, coming from policy perspectives. And this has to do with the reality that there are more formal policies requiring this kind of learning in Northern Europe compared to Canada, as well as in the US as compared to Canada. Ontario is the only province in Canada that requires this kind of teacher candidate learning. But the trend in this policy research is to consider the knowledge, the skills, the dispositions that teacher candidates need to have to work with multilingual learners as competencies, and then therefore to be able to measure them and compare their growth over time. That allows for quantitative approaches to understanding teacher candidate learning, which is actually can be very productive and powerful, but also understanding these things as competencies also flattens or really limits our perspective on what the complications and what the complexity of supporting multilingual learners in schools actually is. And finally, there's also a mountain of research from critical perspectives, looking at teacher education, taking anti-racist perspectives and decolonial perspectives. We've listed here just one example. It's a very prominent example from our colleague in the US, Bree Picower, who's written a very powerful and useful book on reorganizing teacher education based on critical race theory and whiteness perspectives to both challenge the racism inside these programs and to think about teacher education as a liberatory project. As important and helpful as this text is, like many critical studies on teacher education, they are typically silent on the relationship between anti-racism and colonialism or decoloniality and language. That connection is missing in the analysis. So when we look across these various disciplinary perspectives, each of them is missing something really, really important, even if each of them has something really important to offer. So we're trying to pull the best from across these three disciplinary perspectives to apply it to our theoretical framing of the study, which is the next thing I'll talk about. I'm not going to go through the bullet points you see there. This is work from applied linguistic perspectives that does take racism and anti-racism seriously. You can see the references there for your for your own reference later on. What's also important, though, is that this work, while it's gaining more traction and more prominence in applied linguistics, it has yet to make connections to teacher education directly. There are two particular texts that do so. One is a recent text by Daniels and Varghese in the US, a second by Heidi Rösch in Germany, and we have used these as a way to help us make sense of how racism, colonialism, language education, and teacher education work together, and to think about them together. We'll start, I'll say this is my last few words here. I'll start by talking about the Daniels and Varghese text. They pick up on an important idea from Flores and Rosa's theorization of ratiolinguistics and the white listening subject. People may have read about or heard about other contexts. And Daniels and Varghese, they apply that to the notion that teacher education performs its own kind of institutional listening, what they call a white institutional listening. And by that, what they mean is that teacher education both prepares candidates to occupy that subject position of being a white listening subject, to hear, perceive their future students with the expectations of particular cultural linguistic production, and then to learn how to either bridge the gap, the so-called gap between their actual linguistic and cultural lives and this what hegemonic whiteness expects of students, and to police that as well. What's important from their perspective is that teacher candidates are both the products of this white institutional listening, insofar as, in our case, the vast majority of teacher candidates attended school in Ontario, but then they also learn how to occupy that position as future teachers. A second important part of their argument has to do with shifting subjectivities among teacher candidates. For a long time, we've known that teacher candidates are also expert students. They've spent at least 16 years in classrooms and bring that experience of students to bear in terms of what it means to be a teacher. And they're learning how to shift that perspective from students to being teachers. But they're also bringing shifting sensitivities in terms of their own racialized and ratiolinguicized, is the term Daniels and Varghese come up with, their own experiences with race and language in school, and are figuring that out in real time as they respond to teacher education activities and to practicum placements in schools. Finally, Daniels and Varghese highlight for us that many of the solutions that are offered to make teacher education programs better often, in fact, work to reinscribe many of these ratiolinguistic ideologies and practices. That's less the focus of our current paper, but it's a broader focus for the overall project. And then finally, in terms of the contribution Rösch makes to the conversation, she makes an important distinction between two different kinds of language-based discrimination. One, which translates as linguicism, is a kind of, just similar to Skutlam Kangas's definition of linguicism, that focuses on language, the way languages are treated and framed in society, and the social functions they are ascribed. But Rösch also wants to make a connection that takes us away from the languages to focuses on the speakers themselves and the kinds of language-based discrimination that both essentializes speakers in terms of assumptions made based on the way they speak and what they speak, and then orders them and organizes them accordingly. What's really important here, particularly for those in this call who are familiar with ratiolinguistics, is that Rösch has drawn a very similar conclusion to Flores and Rosa without having cited or read that work, particularly the stress she makes on how Lingualisierung, how it works to mishear people, the objective language they produce based on the way they are read as racialized subjects in a migration society. It's a very similar argument that Flores and Rosa make, but they're coming from two very different national and social contexts. The last point I'll say has to do with the privileging that Rösch focuses on, which is to say that this also echoes Rosa and Flores' work, that you don't have to be an individual white person to function or behave or do work as a white listening subject. And she stresses that many people who are themselves racialized and speak minoritized languages, she's working in a German context, because they also have access to and are fluent speakers of standard German, have access to privilege in a way that many of their other racialized and migrant peers do not. So based on this theorization, we asked these three guiding questions for the overall project, which is, how do teacher candidates make sense of new knowledge about supporting multilingual learners? in relation to the racial and linguistic ordering in school that they experienced as students themselves, and again are experiencing now as novice teachers. What are the possibilities and limits of required learning about linguistic diversity and supporting multilingual learners in pre-service programs? And finally, what are the possibilities and limits of new research on translanguaging and changing teacher candidates' thinking and practice about this racial and linguistic ordering of school? And from my perspective, the paper that my colleagues will now share with you comes really from this third research question guiding the overall study. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shakina, to Jennifer, and to Wales.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So now we're going to move on to talking about one small part of the study that focused on, as I introduced earlier on, the preparation of teachers to use translanguaging and multiliteracies when supporting linguistically diverse learners in Ontario's K-12 classrooms. The purpose of the study was to examine whether and how pre-service teacher candidates, whom we're going to call TCs for short from now onwards, whether and how they plan to include their multilingual learners' diverse languages as well as literacies in the classroom, with a specific focus on their writing pedagogy. And there were two main research questions guiding the study. First of all, what are TC's orientations towards supporting MLs, multilingual learners for short, in their writing? And secondly, how do TCs demonstrate their knowledge in supporting multilingual learners in their writing? Now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, who's going to be giving us a quick overview of the theories framing our study.
Thanks, Shakina. So just a brief note on the two theoretical frameworks guiding this paper that we're presenting here today. So the first one, translanguaging, is a theory, and it's gained much attention in the recent years. So following Garcia and Li Wei, this research understands translanguaging as a way of, capturing the extended complex practices of speakers, understanding semiotic practices as both global and local, and languages as social constructions. But translanguaging is more than just a theory. It's also a political stance that disrupts what's happening in schools. So one way this is happening is by challenging the linguistic hierarchies that get reproduced in these educational contexts, that get taken for granted in these spaces. But translanguaging is also understood as a pedagogical approach to language teaching and learning. The next theoretical framework, briefly, multiliteracies, really is calling for an expansion beyond traditional print-based literacies to include, visual, oral, gestural, spatial, and linguistic modes of meaning making. And the principles to support a multiliteracies pedagogy really recognizes the need to have multiliteracies and multimodalities in both the process of writing, but also in the product, the final product of writing. But the problem is that, recent empirical research highlights the dominance of present-day monolingual language ideologies in schools in reinforcing this monolingual voice in writing products, which reifies ideas of language separation and language correctness. We know there's lots of literature on the benefits of translanguaging and multiliteracies. That's very well established. But there is a lack of research on how pre-service teachers have been prepared to use these pedagogies, specifically in mainstream K-12 classrooms. So that's where our research and our paper is filling this gap.
So the data sources for our study included 9 unit plans with a total of 41 lesson plans. So within each unit plan, TCs would usually have 3 to 5 lesson plans within any one unit. So we had a total of 41 lesson plans that were developed by the TCs in 4 cohorts taught by Jeff and I from 2018 to 2020. 1 primary, junior, or PJ cohort, 1 junior, intermediate, or JI cohort, and 2 intermediate, senior, or IS cohorts. And these unit and lesson plans were selected because firstly, they all included a writing component. And then secondly, they represented a range of grade levels from grade 1 all the way up to grade 12. They also represented a range of subjects such as math, social studies, language arts, music, English, history, and biology. The data for the study also came from responses to the Paclit test that was created and administered by the research team. And as Jeff was explaining earlier, this test was adapted from the German DAS-COM test, which assesses pre-service TC's competency for teaching German as a second language in mainstream classrooms in Germany. So the Paclit includes 2 versions. Each version of the test had 5 items and a total of 12 to 13 tasks related to supporting multilingual learners across subjects and grades. I'm going to quickly switch over my screen share to just show you what each version of the Paclit looked like, as well as the item from each version that we selected for our analysis. So give me one quick second while I switch screens. Okay, sorry, it took a while. So this was version 1 of the Paclit, which was administered for 2 TCs in year 1. The first part of the Paclit always does the same thing. It collects demographic information, such as the division that TCs are in, so what grades they're planning on teaching. It also collects information about their languages, so languages that they spoke at home growing up, languages that they use at school, and in other informal as well as formal settings. We also asked them if they had experience teaching any language. This was the item we selected for the analysis from version 1 of the Paclit, and it's called report writing. So maybe I'll just give you a few seconds so you can read this introduction that sets out the context of this item. Okay, so after TCs are given this contextual information, then they're shown this particular chart, and here are the questions they're asked. Question 1, as students complete the various steps of the writing process, would you allow them to use their home languages? If yes, describe how you would support them in doing so. If not, then why not? And this was the particular task within this item that we selected for the analysis. But here was question 2 as well. The lab requires students to consult additional resources when writing up their lab report. How would you accommodate step 1 and 2 students? So step 1 and 2 students refer to students of a beginner language proficiency in this process. I'm not going to go through all of the items and tasks now, but we do have a Q&A session later on. So I'll be happy to come back to version 1 or version 2 of the test if you'd like to look at the other items. But just really quickly scrolling through, you'll see that each item covers a different grade and a different subject area as well. Okay, and then here is version 2 of the Paclit, which was administered to TCs in year 2. And similarly, we asked them for demographic information, and then each item focuses on a different subject and a different grade as well. And the item that we selected from version 2 for the analysis was called residential schools. I'll just scroll down to it, but as I said later, we're happy to come back to this if you'd like to look at the other items. So this was residential schools. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to just read through the introduction before I show you what the questions were. Okay, so this is based on a lesson plan that was actually recommended in the EduGains website. That's an Ontario Ministry of Education sponsored website, and it's a lesson plan about using a text, first of all, to introduce students to the history of the residential schools, and then, based on their understanding and knowledge gleaned through this text, students are writing an essay, I believe, in response to this question: should the government compensate Indigenous peoples for how they were treated? If so, what would be fair compensation for this historical wrongdoing? And then here are the questions TCs were asked to respond to after that. First one, the sample lesson plan suggests that students create a fishbone organizer like this one in the picture to help demonstrate the understanding of the text. What do students have to know about the conventional structure of expository text to create this fishbone organizer successfully? And then here's the second question, which was the question we analyzed for the study. You and your coworker are trying to integrate students' home languages more into the life of your classrooms. Which passive strategies might you use to integrate home languages, and which more active, more kind of intentional strategies would you use to integrate students' home languages? Which of these would be the most appropriate for this lesson, and why? And then the third question here, which we did not analyze for the study, ask about assessment and how the success criteria for an assessment based on the paper might change for a student on a beginner level of the STEP continuum. The STEP is the official assessment tool that's used in Ontario schools, versus a student who is more advanced on the STEP continuum. So again, happy to come back to these items later on, but we'll just move on now in talking about the data sources and analysis for now. So just sorry, give me a quick second again while I just switch over the screen share. All right. Okay, so moving on to just before we get to the other, the analysis, I just wanted to let you know that based on those two tasks, the report writing and residential schools items, tasks that we selected from the two items, we were able to analyze 490 responses altogether. 299 for report writing, and then 199 for residential schools. And these responses came from more than 410 TCs across those different divisions. We created a coding scheme for our analysis based on adapted dimensions from Saskia Van Wiegen and Sandra Zappa-Holman's 2020 matrix on plurilingual pedagogies. There were originally 3 dimensions in their matrix. We adapted these 3 dimensions, and then we added 2 new dimensions as well. And we created our own descriptions or interpretations of each of these dimensions in order to operationalize these dimensions as codes for our analysis. So the first adapted dimension in our coding scheme was teacher-initiated or student-initiated translanguaging. And by teacher-initiated translanguaging, we're talking about when the teacher is the one who initiates and directs the use of various languages in the classroom, whereas student-initiated translanguaging is when learners themselves are independently initiating the use of their home languages and other languages, and they're choosing how to use their diverse language practices. The second adapted dimension was planned or spontaneous engagement with translanguaging. By planned engagement, we're referring to an intentional implementation of teaching strategies by the teacher, which activates students' full linguistic repertoires. By spontaneous engagement, we're talking about the unplanned and most spontaneous sort of discursive practices of learners that naturally occur both inside and outside the classroom. The third dimension we adapted, we call translanguaging as a scaffold for English or as a resource for curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. So by scaffold for English, we're referring to when teachers have a stance where they're including home languages, they're including different languages through translanguaging, but only as a way to transition students to English. By resource for curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, we're talking about when teachers view all of the linguistic features and practices of students as a resource in general, as well as specifically for their learning. And when they're integrating translanguaging, not just as a scaffold towards English, but they're integrating it into the curriculum, into the classroom pedagogy, into assessment, in order to create a more multilingual ecology in the classroom. And then here are the 2 dimensions that we added to this matrix: supporting traditional and multimodal literacies. By traditional literacy, here we're referring to when teachers and learners engage with the traditional skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking, but as discrete, separate skills. And by multimodal literacies, we're drawing on the multiliteracies framework, where a more fluid approach to literacies is envisioned, and various modes that are interconnected, such as linguistic, visual, audio, gestural, spatial, and combination of modes are integrated into the classroom. And the final dimension we added to this matrix is monolingual or translanguaging orientation. Pretty straightforward, but a monolingual orientation would adopt an understanding of language as bounded, so languages as separate from each other. It would reinforce and uncritically uphold standard language as well as monolingual ideologies and practices, and exclude the use of other languages in the classroom. And a translanguaging orientation would see language as dynamic, fluid, integrated. It would include both teacher-initiated as well as student-initiated home language use. Moving on to our data analysis procedures. Each response to the Paclit items was analyzed deductively by applying those codes from those 5 dimensions to them. We want to say that we saw those dimensions as spectrums rather than as dichotomous categories. So there were times when a response could fall between those 2 codes or between the 2 ends of the spectrum. For example, sometimes it was clearly a monolingual or clearly a translanguaging orientation, but in many cases it fell in between, and you're going to see examples of how it would fall in between. So when it fell kind of in between, we also had the option of coding that response as other. After the Paclit responses were coded, we also calculated frequencies and percentages in order, not yet, we haven't yet, tried to determine statistically significant patterns yet, but we just wanted to look at any broad interesting patterns in the responses according to item. As for the unit plans and lesson plans, we first broke them down into categories to make them more manageable, because a unit plan could go all the way up to 30 to 50 pages. So we broke them down into categories such as the learning objectives, the activities, the materials, the assessments, the profiles of learners, and so on. Then we analyzed each one of those categories deductively using the same codes. And we're going to present the results of the analysis of the Paclit responses and the unit and lesson plans in the following part of the presentation according to the dimensions of the matrix. So back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Shakina. So I'm going to start with the dimension on monolingualism and translanguaging and the monolingual and or translanguaging orientation to writing. So that was the last dimension mentioned by Shakina. So this is one we contributed to the matrix. Okay, so if we look at the next, yes, here. So regarding, you see on the left-hand side, so the report writing versus the residential schools on the right-hand side, you can see, quite a difference in those numbers there. So in the report writing, when teacher candidates were asked if they would allow students to use their home languages to support the writing process, only 44% were quoted as having a translanguaging orientation, 22 as a monolingual, and then 34 as other. And other referred to, what kind of fell in between, as Shakina had mentioned. So those were like conditions that were based on various circumstances or situations, such as like the teacher candidate's access to the home language of the student, or the familiarity of the student's language. And I'm going to provide some more examples of instances that fell into that kind of in between space. And then on the right hand side, the residential school item, it already assumed within the question, it already assumed that teacher candidates would integrate students' home languages into their classroom practices. So it's not surprising that the codes for translanguaging orientation is higher. So it instead asked them, that question asked them how they would do so. So in this case, the translanguaging orientations in TC's response were 90%, 4% for monolingual, and then 6% for other. Okay, so I'm gonna show you one of the observations we made as it pertained to the unit and lesson plans was in regard to how TCs imagined multilingual learners. So when TCs imagined multilingual learners and didn't, so they either imagined them or they drew on real multilingual learners, either that they had in their classroom, or as Jeff presented at the beginning of this presentation, those me maps, the Flipgrid students, where they were real multilingual learners. So in terms of the imagined multilingual learners, we observed that teacher candidates' lesson plans, the modifications and accommodations for these multilingual learners were more broad, they were general, and they demonstrated mostly a monolingual orientation. Translanguaging kind of felt like an add-on or maybe an afterthought. So here's an example on the bottom left-hand screen. In a grade 12 biology class, ELL students, this was the modification suggested. ELL students are encouraged to develop vocabulary or new terminology and grammar in their first language to support the reading of science texts and scientific writing. So in contrast, for those TCs who base their unit and their lesson plans on real and not imagined multilingual learners, there was evidence in those lesson plans of more specific and more nuanced modifications. And then also individualized accommodations were provided for these real students. These TCs made profiles of their multilingual learners, and they referenced and paid attention and demonstrated knowledge on more than just language. So they saw these multilingual learners as encompassing, they talked about the social, emotional, geographic, and familiar information. And that information, of course, is useful for teacher candidates to plan their multimodal and multilingual tasks and activities. So just in the next screen, I'll show you an example of what that looks like of a teacher candidate writing a real profile of a multilingual learner that they included in their lesson plan. And this is just an example of what's possible when TCs are thinking beyond the label of, like, let's say, English language learner, and they're able to contextualize their multilingual learners as real learners, focusing, of course, beyond just language aspects. Okay, so the next one, the second observation we made in the unit and lesson plans was in reference to the type of lesson plans that the TCs were creating. So they demonstrated a more of a translanguaging orientation when the lesson plans were more language focused. So when they were language arts or social studies lesson plans, compared to subject specific lesson plans like science and math, which tended to be more monolingual in orientation. But some of the most common rationales for a translanguaging orientation were TC's awareness of the difference between the content and the language objectives. So an understanding that language is maybe what is preventing students from demonstrating their content knowledge. And then the second most common rationale was in prioritizing representation, recognizing the importance of class materials, reflecting the diversities and identities of the students in their classes, and then also valuing students' linguistic resources and using translanguaging really as a resource for learning. There were a few teacher candidates that demonstrated, a curiosity for and willingness towards language inclusive teaching, but many were really unsure in their responses of how to provide that support. In the next slide, I'm going to share the three most common conditions for translanguaging. So the first one was that, okay, let's do translanguaging, but the condition was, let's limit translanguaging to those beginner multilingual learners. So since students are at a beginner level, I would allow them to use their home languages to help them communicate their ideas. The second condition was translanguaging for private but not public use. So allowing them to speak their language, let's say in a small group or with peers in their class, but then when they had to report to the class as a whole, wanting to shift into the language of the school as English. Okay, and then the third most common condition for translanguaging was for specific purposes. So for instructions or for explanations, in this example here, I'd allow them to use their home language to support their explanation, but for the most part, it should be in English because they are in an academic course that leads them into university, which uses English as a language of instruction. Also, they are in the English-speaking country, so this would better prepare them for the daily uses of the language. And so those three were the most common conditions of having a translanguaging orientation.
And now we're going to talk about examples from the analysis that pertain to the second dimension, translanguaging as a scaffold for English or a resource for curriculum pedagogy and assessment. The majority of responses to the report writing item, that's the item where we gave them a choice, would you include home languages or not, were coded as translanguaging as scaffold, where only 13% were coded as translanguaging as resource. So, sorry, I forgot to show that. So most TCs considered translanguaging as a way to scaffold students while they brainstormed items and while they worked on the initial steps of the writing process, but they specified that they would use a scaffolded approach to transition them to use English only. And they were very clear in saying that learners' final products should be completed and submitted only in English. And once again, TCs provided several rationales for requiring English-only products. Their first rationale that came up again and again was to make the writing of their students more accessible to them as teachers, as illustrated in this quote. I would allow discussion and peer feedback in their home language, but since I have to grade it and I'm only fluent in English, I don't see how I could accept the final written product in any language other than English. The second rationale related to conflating translanguaging with translation. So many people, mistook translation for translanguaging, and they suggested that home language use could actually lead to an over-reliance on translation. Example here was, I would allow them to talk with other students who speak the same language or use Google Translate. However, I would expect their reliance on translation to diminish over the course of the semester and for all final results to be presented in English. The third rationale was related to preparing their learners for standardized and school-based assessments in English. And here's an example. I would allow students to write their initial answers in their native language, so they have a reference of the materials that were being taught, but I would need those answers to be translated by students into English, because for evaluation and assignments, I can only mark answers that are written in English, as that's the language that I know and one of the primary languages in Canada. So many TCs invoked the importance of English as the primary language of Canada or the official language of the country. They implied that getting newcomer learners to submit work in their home languages would be akin to isolating them in a language they're not comfortable with, meaning isolating them in their home language, and that they were actually doing their learners a favor by preparing them to integrate into Canadian society and the English language. Responses to the residential schools item, where we didn't give them a choice, where we said, okay, you're finding ways to integrate languages now, how would you do that? So the responses to that item were strikingly different, with many more examples of how translanguaging could act as a pedagogical resource. TCs were asked for, and they recommended active and passive strategies to include translanguaging beyond the writing process. And in the active strategies, translanguaging was usually envisioned as a resource for a variety of purposes. The first purpose being the creation of multilingual written products. So multilingual products where students use both their home languages and English. Secondly, to encourage criticality and creativity, for example, allowing students to respond creatively to course content through journals, and helping students construct their response to critical questions around residential schools and reconciliation. The third way that translanguaging was seen as a resource was to create a welcoming classroom environment, for example, through posters promoting different languages and just creating an inclusive and welcoming classroom environment. Fourthly, to affirm cultural diversity and diversify the curriculum. For example, allowing spaces for students to incorporate their cultures and history into class, finding ways to diversify Canadian history. Fifthly, to promote classroom-wide language learning. So students in the class in general, not just multilingual learners, can benefit from learning a new language. Number 6, drawing on the expertise of family and community members by creating opportunities for students to interview their parents and community members and invite them into the classroom space. And very importantly, to develop learners' understanding of Indigenous languages and cultures and the importance of maintaining their own linguistic and cultural heritage. So one example here given by TC was that given Canada's history of Indigenous people in particular, I would argue that an active translanguaging approach would speak more to intentional reconciliation. Another TC said it might be interesting for students to consider the importance of their own language and culture, and then consider how those same feelings might have been amplified by Indigenous children who were put in residential schools. As the unit lesson plans were completed over a few months as opposed to just in one sitting like the Paclit items, and because the unit lesson plans were paired with intentional teaching about translanguaging by Jeff and I during class, there were many more instances of translanguaging being incorporated and taken up as a pedagogical resource in these particular data sources. And I'm just going to give you one example from a grade 4 unit on language arts creative writing, which combined poetry writing and music. So in lesson 1 of this unit, TCs planned for their students to work in small groups to rewrite or to remix English as well as multilingual poems and songs to make them more reflective of their linguistic and cultural identities. And the multilingual learners in each group would be given the opportunity to actually be the leaders, to take the lead during this activity. And then in another lesson, lesson 5 from the same unit, students would be paired with multilingual writing partners, and they would organize their ideas for their poems into this Freya model that you see in the second visual here, containing all of their languages. In the rationale that the TCs provided for incorporating translanguaging in these as well as other ways in this unit, they talked about the importance of giving multilingual learners a leadership role, letting them express their sense of belonging and identity. And they talked about how ELLs, the multilingual learners, could benefit from these lessons, and other learners in the classroom could benefit as well, because the materials used would center around them and their languages and cultures.
So I will now talk about the third dimension, which is supporting traditional literacy or multimodal literacies in writing. Now, for the analysis of this dimension on supporting traditional literacy and multimodal literacies in writing, we found that TCs responded with mainly writing and print for the report writing item, 55% that had that response, and only 37% of responses to the residential schools item would specify that reading, writing, listening, and or speaking skills that the multilingual learners would need to complete the task, which is not a surprise considering that the report writing does specify writing as one of the skills, even in the prompt. So TCs focused on writing and print, including digital print as the medium to use in the report writing item. And for example, they viewed writing as a discrete skill by describing the writing of text as the only part of the writing process and using print as the medium for dictionaries and worksheets. Responses often included allowing students to use dictionaries to translate words or provide translations on worksheets. One TC wrote, I would allow students to use their home languages for the activity. After, I would ask students to use a dictionary to translate as best as possible. For the residential schools item, they recommended note-taking in home languages and writing their ideas in their own language as a draft. TCs incorporated both traditional and multimodal literacies during the process of learning and in the final product. For example, in the residential schools item, they recommended the use of digital tools such as Google Translate during the process of learning, but the final product would be written in text. Other examples included the use of graphic organizers and multilingual word balls. In a grade 4 language arts unit on story writing, the TC recommended movement and visuals by having multilingual learners tell their stories in their home language or incorporate home language words into their charades. And in a grade 12 biology unit plan on homeostasis, the TCs made an accommodation for multilingual learners to be in a computer lab for a video lesson assignment so that they can watch the video at their own pace, giving them the option to have the visuals and to be able to interact somewhat with the audio and visual component there. So multimodal literacies underscored in active and passive strategies. 31% of the report item responses reflected multimodal strategies. In comparison, though, to the residential schools item, it had 52%. And there were more responses that supported multimodal literacies because the prompt was more open-ended. TCs were asked to provide passive and active strategies, making room for more responses that made use of multimodal ways to complete and present the final product, rather than only working with text. In these responses, passive translanguaging strategies were usually student-initiated, whereas active translanguage strategies tended to involve teacher-initiated strategies. So let's take a look here at some of the strategies. So some of the strategies to support multimodal literacies included the use of kinesthetic movement as an active strategy, such as discussing in groups with the same home language, moving from one pod to another, or sharing artifacts from their homes which represent their home lives. One TC responded, passive strategies could be incorporating books or videos or residential school survivors into the lessons, which may match some Indigenous languages that my students speak at home. So when it comes to supporting traditional literacy or multimodal literacies in writing, understanding literacies from a traditional perspective would categorize reading, writing, listening, and speaking as discrete skills, as I had mentioned before. However, the shift towards the use of multimodal literacies to support multilingual learners in completing the task provide more creative and innovative ways for translanguaging strategies to be implemented, as literacies are no longer fostered only through text, which you can see from some of these examples that the TCs provided. In this last dimension, it was originally 2 separate dimensions, but as we were coding, we noticed that teacher-initiated translanguaging were often planned and student-initiated translanguaging were mostly spontaneous. So we grouped these 2 dimensions together in our analysis so that it forms teacher or student-initiated and planned or spontaneous translanguaging practices. Now, many of the Paclit responses were teacher-initiated translanguaging practices, with 42% responses from the report writing item and 32% from the residential school item. And teacher-initiated translanguaging, TCs are more involved in working with multilingual learners during the writing process. For example, TCs would translate content and ask for support and expertise from ELL support staff. One TC wrote, they would ideally sit with a student who could speak both English and Mandarin to translate the worksheet. I would then have the students complete their work and use translation sites, scribes, or other devices to translate work. So as you can see here, even with the translation process, the teacher is there to guide them first and to also give them the option to continue on later on when they are working independently. Both in the Paclit data and lesson plans, the TCs were, continuing on with some of the other things that that the teachers had initiated too. With the grade 12 English short story unit for the elements of a short story lesson, the TCs had as a translanguaging objective, use their home languages as a tool to complete the different tasks outlined. They included translanguaging opportunities in a lesson activity where multilingual learners could write in any language or draw to express their understanding of character traits. So as you can see here again, there's many different ways to approach entry points for them to express their knowledge. In a grade 9 English unit plan on poetry on the next slide that I'm going to show you, translanguaging practices were teacher initiated and planned. So if you can see here, multilingual learners could receive support from the teacher if they had any questions. So there is the opportunity to address the teacher about any concerns or issues. They could use their home languages to complete their journals. And they also could have the choice of using translation tools. So here at this next section, if students are not familiar with the topic, they're able to use their translators. So here with student initiated translanguaging practices, they were much lower with 14% from the report writing responses and 14% also from the residential school responses. In student initiated translanguaging, teachers were less involved in engaging multilingual learners with how to use their home languages for learning, placing the onus of responsibility on the students to think about how to use their linguistic repertoire to understand the content and complete the tasks. Some examples of student-initiated translanguaging in the data included multilingual learners reading, writing, researching, or discussing in their home languages, and teachers not enforcing the English-only rule. So it's very hands-off. There isn't really any follow-up in their responses as to like, what does it mean to allow them to do that, or what kind of strategies would they include so that can foster the multilingual learners to be able to, really go into like the use of their linguistic repertoire. So in this case, the teacher candidates reduced the translanguaging practices to add-ons for the lesson plans with little explanation as to how multilingual learners could utilize their full linguistic repertoire. And in this, in this teacher candidates annotation for a grade 11 world history unit on flourishing societies and civilizations, students would converse or brainstorm in home languages by working in the same language groups for the introduction lesson. And according to the TC's annotation here, multilingual learners could be grouped with a language proficient peer, and they had the opportunity to work with students who spoke the same language. But the teacher did not provide further guidance or any specific steps for students on how to implement the translanguaging practices when collaborating with others. The responses that were coded as other usually consisted of teachers offering the option of allowing for translanguaging practices, but it was the students making the choice to do so. So it was a combination of the student and the teacher here involved in the translanguaging practice. 45% of responses in the report writing item and 32% of the responses in the residential schools item were teacher-initiated translanguaging practices with spontaneous translanguaging by the multilingual learner. The strategies offered by the teacher include the use of translating and translation tools. Again, we seem to see this happening very often, that translation tools are a part of this process. Working with the same language groups or partners, and including home languages in the writing process, but not in the product. TransLanguaging was not always pedagogically supported, since the teacher candidates again placed the onus of responsibility on the students to access their home languages. This was demonstrated through responses such as allowing the students to access dictionaries, allowing to talk to a peer who shares the same L1, and allowing them to use their home languages. So this kind of like permission to give them that option. Planned translanguaging practices by the teacher candidates made up 47% for the report item and 70% for the residential schools item. As mentioned earlier, passive translanguaging strategies were usually student initiated, but the active translanguaging strategies tended to involve teacher initiated strategies. So in this case here, you can see that the planned practice was really more on the teacher to provide that option, but of course students can also initiate that in the classroom. So in an example of a passive translanguaging strategy was offering students the option to use home languages, but without providing additional support. A couple of active translanguaging strategies included encouraging students to write in their home languages, receiving peer feedback from the same home language group, or asking students to share keywords of the lesson and their translations. There were fewer responses by teacher candidates on spontaneous translanguaging practices, with only 15% for the report writing item and 10% for the residential schools item. These responses were usually student initiated, such as asking the students to speak or write in their home language if they felt comfortable, and they mainly involved TCs not restricting home language use in the class. So to wrap things up, this study does provide a lot of evidence for teacher candidates developing their knowledge base on the use of translanguaging and multiliteracies pedagogies to support multilingual learners in their writing. From the responses to the Paclit items and their unit and lesson plans, teacher candidates incorporated various multimodal translanguaging strategies they had learned from this supporting multilingual learners course. Now, these include multilingual research, multilingual word walls, Freire models, graphic organizers, and online translation tools. However, there were also constraints to teacher candidates' understanding of translanguaging. So some of them include imposing conditions. So these are some of the things that we had mentioned earlier, imposing conditions on the use of translanguaging, such as when they would allow for it in the class. Another constraint was allowing translanguaging in the writing process, but not the product, which reinforced these monolingual language ideologies, as students' final writing products were, again, expected to be in English only. They reduced translanguaging to a scaffold towards English rather than as a pedagogy to foster multilingualism and create language inclusive classrooms. There were often gaps and contradictions between teacher candidates' orientations towards translanguaging and their actual pedagogical demonstration of this knowledge. Many teacher candidates indicated an openness towards the use of home languages in their Paclit responses, but then when it came to the design of the unit and lesson plans, they didn't always implement it. When translanguaging and multiliteracies were incorporated into teacher candidates' instructional plans, they were often described as accommodations for learners of lower English proficiency levels rather than as the whole class strategy. This indicates that multilingual learners were often an afterthought when planning for lessons. And finally, systemic and structural constraints such as school and educational boards' policies, curriculum expectations, and even limits to time have an impact on teacher candidates' choices and planning with translanguaging strategies. So from our findings, we developed some recommendations here. To begin, a teacher education program should start with translanguaging and multiliteracies as the norm. With this approach, teacher candidates are prepared for the linguistic and cultural diversity of the multilingual classrooms that they are going to be in. So what could this involve? Teacher education programs should prepare TCs to enact translanguaging and multiliteracies pedagogies for not only language learning purposes, but also to enact through a critical lens. Teacher candidates responses for including translanguaging often had conditions, which reflected a very like monolingual approach or ideology. And so to address this, teacher education programs need to encourage teacher candidates to think about the political implications of translanguaging and critique language hierarchies that exist in the school systems with an equity and social justice approach, so that TCs develop an understanding of translanguaging and multiliteracies as critical pedagogies. This way, multilingual learners' cultural identities and linguistic repertoires are not marginalized in the classroom. The adapted matrix that we've presented here can be used as an heuristic in teacher education so that the TCs can explore and reflect on their own orientations and pedagogical practices. Since one of the constraints with implementing translanguaging strategies is a gap between the TC's orientations and their practices, teacher educators can discuss how orientations and practices captured in the matrix need to work together and show TCs how to apply this matrix across subject areas, grade levels, and so on, so that they can reflect on how they think about and implement translanguaging and multiliteracies pedagogies. What was also often reflected in the TC's responses and unit lesson plans were translanguaging strategies as an add-on rather than a strategic use of translanguaging. To support teacher educators' planning, TCs need to be taught how to integrate. So for example, integrating spontaneous translanguaging practices into a more comprehensive translanguaging pedagogy. This could consist of TCs learning active translanguaging strategies so that they are embedded throughout an activity or lesson, and so that teachers can, or TCs can provide more guidance on how to make fully the use of the multilingual learners' linguistic repertoire. So thank you for listening to our results and the findings and everything that we've like really worked so hard on for the last couple of years with this study, and specifically with the part that that me and my colleagues have worked on for the past couple of months in coming together for this presentation. So what are the things that we should consider now after having gone through all of that? And so we pose to you in the discussion that we're going to have some of the, not only your questions, but some of the things that have come to our minds when we were kind of just summarizing all the things that we've come across. First of all, what were some key points or takeaways for you? Number two, does any of the findings resonate with your own experiences? And with that, we do understand that everybody is coming from very different contexts. And so the third question then is, what are implications of this study for your own context or practice? Like if you're in teacher ed, if you're teaching, if you're into policy, or if there's curriculum development that you're involved in, assessment and so on, any of those contexts and practices, I think that really will illuminate for the rest of us that are working in different capacities to understand a little bit more how all these really come together to support the multilingual learner, if we really can think about how translanguaging and multiliteracies is a very important part of their writing skills, because that's kind of like the two prompts that really focused on in the Paclit and in their unit plans. So we'll hand it over to the moderator, I think, and thank you for listening.
Great.
Thanks so much. Over to you, Sarkam. Oh, is it me, Moira? Go ahead.
I'm taking over now. So just want to thank firstly Shakina, Jennifer Wales, and Professor Bale for giving us this excellent presentation on a Friday. It really was so illuminating, and we got to learn so much from all your hard work for the last few years, and we really do appreciate it. And I don't want to take up too much with my spiel because I know there's a lot of comments and questions waiting in the wings. So if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and then you can unmute your mic and ask your question or make your comment. Or if you want to put it in the chat box, I can read it out for you, and we can see what our presenters have to say. So the floor is open for questions and comments. So please